I never thought calling my husband a beta would end our marriage. But here I am, sitting in my half-empty apartment, wondering how everything fell apart so fast. I'm Lauren, 32, and honestly, I still don't think what I did was that big of a deal. Thomas totally overreacted. That's always been his problem. He can't take a joke and gets all sensitive over the smallest things. When we first got together 3 years ago, I was actually impressed by Thomas. He wasn't like the other guys I'd been with, and trust me, I'd been with plenty. Most of my exes were exciting but total losers, career-wise. Like Zach, who was this tattoo artist who couldn't pay rent half the time but was wild in bed. Or Lamar, who was literally a bartender at 35 with plans to open his own place someday. Then there was Derek, who rode a motorcycle and had that bad boy thing going, but couldn't hold down a job for more than 3 months. I went through a whole phase where I dated these exciting guys who turned out to be complete disappointments in the long run. Thomas was different. He had a real job as a financial consultant, an actual savings account, and plans for the future that weren't just talk. He wasn't the hottest guy I dated or the most thrilling, but I was getting tired of dating man-children, you know? I thought I was being mature by choosing stability over excitement. My friends were all settling down, posting their engagement rings and baby announcements, while I was still dealing with guys who'd forget their wallet when we went out to dinner. At first, I really tried to appreciate Thomas for who he was. He was reliable. When he said he'd be somewhere at 7, he'd show up at 6:55. He remembered birthdays. He had a 5-year plan that included a house in the suburbs. But after the honeymoon phase wore off, I started noticing things that bugged me, like how he'd always ask the waiter for recommendations instead of just ordering. Or how he'd spend 15 minutes researching the best driving route when I would have just used GPS and figured it out on the way. I noticed it especially when we were around other people. At parties, he'd hang back and listen instead of commanding attention like my ex Mark used to do. When someone would interrupt him, he'd just let them talk instead of pushing back. It started to feel like I was married to this pushover. I began making little comments, testing him. "You're just gonna let him talk to you like that?" Or, "Why didn't you speak up in that meeting? That was your idea they were discussing." I thought I was helping him. Seriously, I was trying to push him to be more assertive because I knew he had potential. He was smart and had good ideas, but he wasn't the type to throw them in people's faces. In my experience, that's not how you get ahead in life. I've always had to fight for what I wanted, and I couldn't understand why Thomas wouldn't do the same. About 6 months ago, things started getting worse between us. I'd make these little comments, and instead of taking my advice, he'd get quiet. We'd be at dinner with friends, and I'd tell some story about how my ex Lamar would have handled a work situation differently than Thomas had, and he'd give me this look, not angry, just tired, and like he just didn't care what I was saying at all. But I didn't stop, because I honestly thought I was helping him man up a little because I've been around real men. I feel like, I don't know. I was just trying to be a good wife. My friend Alyssa told me I was being too hard on him. But what does she know? She's married to Dave, who literally asks her permission to go golfing with his buddies. I didn't want that kind of relationship where I was in charge of everything. I wanted a partner who could take control sometimes, who wouldn't make me feel like I had to make all the decisions. I started creating little tests for Thomas. I'd purposely leave decisions up to him, then criticize whatever he chose. "You really want to watch that movie?" Or, "That's the restaurant you picked?" I was trying to push him to be more confident in his choices, to stop second-guessing himself all the time. But he just kept getting quieter, retreating into himself more. The more successful Thomas got at work, the more it bothered me. He got this promotion to senior consultant, and when he told me about it, he mentioned how he'd built consensus among the team and collaborated with the directors. I smiled and congratulated him, but inside I was thinking, why can't you just admit you crushed the competition? It was like he was allergic to appearing competitive or aggressive, even when the situation called for it. Our sex life started suffering too. I'd suggest trying new things, and he'd be hesitant, wanting to talk about it first. My ex Ryan would have just taken charge, you know? But Thomas always wanted to make sure I was comfortable, which somehow made everything less exciting. I started going to bed early some nights just to avoid the disappointment. Last week was when I really started ramping up my Project Thomas. That's what I started calling it in my head. My mission to get my husband to show some backbone. We were planning to attend Garrett and Melanie's housewarming party that weekend, and I knew most of Thomas's college friends would be there, including Ryan, who Thomas always seemed to want to impress. Ryan was everything Thomas wasn't: confident, outspoken, and honestly kind of hot in that effortless way. He was single, ran his own tech startup, and always had stories about his adventures rock climbing or traveling to random countries. Whenever we'd hang out with him, I'd notice how Thomas would get quieter, like he was intimidated by his own friend. It was embarrassing. I decided to use the party as an opportunity to push Thomas out of his comfort zone. The Tuesday before, I started casually dropping hints about how Ryan had recently closed some big deal with investors. I saw on Instagram that Ryan's company just got a huge funding round. Bet he'll be talking about it at the party. You should mention that project you're working on too. Thomas just shrugged and said, "If it comes up naturally, maybe." That made me so frustrated. Naturally? That's your problem, Thomas. You always wait for things to happen, instead of making them happen. I wasn't trying to be mean, I was trying to light a fire under him. His response? He put down his fork during dinner and said, "Lauren, not everything is a competition. Ryan and I are different people." Then he just went back to eating like I hadn't said anything important. I stepped up my game as the week went on. I purposely left the car with almost no gas, knowing Thomas would have to fill it up before work. When he mentioned it that evening, I said, "Well, Brian would have just filled it up without complaining about it." Brian was this guy I dated before Thomas, who was kind of a jerk, but at least took care of things without making me feel guilty. Thomas looked at me for a long moment and then said, "I wasn't complaining. I was just letting you know." Then he walked away and spent the rest of the evening in his home office. I could tell he was annoyed, but at least he was showing some kind of emotion. Friday night, I decided to step things up even more. We were getting ready for bed, and I started telling him about this podcast I was listening to about alpha and beta males in relationships. I was watching his face in the mirror as I explained how real alphas take control in every aspect of their lives. He kept brushing his teeth, not saying anything, but I could see that muscle in his jaw twitching, the one that shows up when he's holding back anger. "The thing is," I said, "most women don't actually want to be married to a beta. It's just not exciting." I was trying to get a reaction, any reaction, out of him. He spit into the sink and rinsed his mouth before finally looking at me. "And what am I, according to your podcast?" His voice was so controlled it was almost scary, but at least he was engaging. I shrugged, playing it cool. "I'm just saying there's a spectrum, and maybe you could benefit from being a little more assertive." "Right," he said, "because your exes were such great role models of masculinity." He walked past me into the bedroom, and I was actually excited. He was pushing back. This was progress. But then the next morning, he acted like nothing had happened. We got ready for Garrett's party, and he was his usual calm, measured self. On the drive there, I brought up my ex Tyler, who was this fitness trainer I dated briefly. Tyler always said you can tell a lot about a man by how he carries himself at social gatherings, I said casually. He said the natural leaders don't try to be the center of attention, people just naturally focus on them. Thomas's hands tightened on the steering wheel. "And I suppose Tyler was a natural leader?" His voice had that edge again. "Well, yeah," I said. "People always listened when he spoke. He didn't fade into the background." Thomas just nodded, and we drove the rest of the way in silence. I thought maybe, just maybe, I was finally getting through to him. Little did I know I was pushing him right to his breaking point. Garrett and Melanie's new house was amazing. One of those modern farmhouse styles with the big open kitchen that flows into the living room. When we arrived, there were already about 15 people there, including Ryan, who came over immediately to greet us. I noticed how confidently he hugged me hello, while Thomas just stood there holding our bottle of wine like he was waiting for permission to exist in the space. I grabbed a glass of wine from the kitchen and started chatting with Melanie and some women I recognized from previous get-togethers, but I was keeping an eye on Thomas the whole time. From across the room, I could see him standing in the circle of guys, mostly listening as usual. Ryan was telling some story that had everyone laughing, completely commanding the space. After catching up with the women, I drifted over to where Thomas was. I'd had 2 glasses of wine by then and was feeling pretty good. I slid my arm through his and joined the conversation, which had shifted to relationships. All I'm saying, Garrett was explaining, is that sometimes you have to compromise. Melanie wanted the gray cabinets, I wanted white, so we went with a light gray. Marriage is about meeting in the middle. I couldn't help myself. I rolled my eyes dramatically. That's such a typical response, I said. Sometimes someone just needs to make a decision and stick with it. The conversation shifted to how they handled disagreements with their partners, and Thomas mentioned how we were renovating our kitchen and had different ideas about the backsplash. We're exploring options that will satisfy both of our tastes, he said. It's our home, so we both need to be happy with it. Maybe it was the wine, or maybe it was weeks of frustration building up, but something in me just snapped when I heard him say that. Before I could stop myself, the words just tumbled out. God, Thomas, could you be any more of a beta? The words hung in the air. There was this moment of complete silence, and I saw something flash across Thomas's face. Hurt, then anger, then something else I couldn't read. A couple of the guys coughed uncomfortably, and then Ryan let out this surprised laugh, which made a few others chuckle nervously. Instead of backing down, the reaction encouraged me. I doubled down. No, seriously, I continued, nudging Ryan with my elbow. He's always like this. Let's explore options. Let's find middle ground. Meanwhile, I'm the one who has to make all the actual decisions because he won't take a stand on anything. More uncomfortable laughs, but I was on a roll now. You guys know what I mean, right? Like last month, I caught him looking at pictures of feet online, I said with an exaggerated wink at Ryan. I mean, at least have the confidence to own your weird stuff, right? That got a few genuine laughs, probably from the shock value, but I also noticed how Garrett and a couple of others were shifting uncomfortably. Thomas had gone completely still beside me. Lauren? His voice was quiet, but had this quality I'd never heard before. Everyone stopped laughing immediately. Are you finished? The way he said it, not angry, not raised, but with this cold control, made my stomach drop. For the first time, I wondered if I'd gone too far. What? I tried to keep my tone light. It's just a joke. Everyone knows you're... I asked if you were finished. He cut me off, his eyes holding mine steadily. The circle around us had gone totally quiet. I felt my face getting hot. Don't be so sensitive, I said, trying to salvage the situation. I was just... Humiliating me in front of our friends? Thomas finished. Yes, I gathered that. He turned to the group. Excuse me for a minute. Then he walked away, heading toward the back door. Ryan let out a low whistle. Damn, Lauren, that was cold. I felt defensive immediately. Oh, please, like you guys don't joke around with each other all the time. Garrett shook his head slightly. Not like that, Lauren. Not like that. The conversation broke up awkwardly after that. I decided to give Thomas a few minutes to cool off before going to find him. I grabbed another glass of wine and rejoined the women, trying to act like nothing had happened. About 20 minutes later, I realized I hadn't seen Thomas come back inside. I went to check on him, figuring he'd had enough time to get over himself. I walked through the kitchen and out the back door, but the patio was empty. I looked around the backyard, thinking maybe he'd gone for a walk, but no sign of him. I went back inside and checked every room, but he wasn't there. A knot of unease started forming in my stomach. Finally, I grabbed my phone to text him, only to find I already had 5 missed texts from him. I've gone home. Find your own way back. I'm done with this. Don't call me. I don't want to talk right now. I mean it, Lauren. I stared at my phone in disbelief. He'd left me? He'd actually left me at the party? I rushed to the front window and looked out at the driveway. Our car was gone. That pathetic, oversensitive little... I muttered under my breath, typing back furiously. Are you kidding me right now? You're proving my point. Get back here. Thomas, this is so embarrassing. What am I supposed to tell everyone? No response. I called him and it went straight to voicemail. He'd turned off his phone. I stood in Garrett and Melanie's entryway, feeling a bizarre mix of rage, embarrassment, and fear. Thomas had never done anything like this before. Ever. Everything okay? It was Melanie, looking at me with concern and something else. Judgment? I forced a smile. Oh yeah, Thomas just got called into work. Some client emergency. The lie sounded hollow even to my own ears. Melanie's expression made it clear she didn't believe me. I see. Do you need a ride home later? The humiliation burned in my chest. No, I'll just get an Uber. I stayed at the party for another hour, trying to save face, but it was torture. People were clearly talking about us. Conversations would stop when I approached, and I kept catching pitying glances. By the time my Uber arrived, I was a mess of emotions. Anger at Thomas for embarrassing me, indignation that everyone seemed to be taking his side, and a growing sense of dread about what would happen when I got home. In the back of the Uber, I checked my phone again. Still nothing from Thomas. I sent another text. I'm on my way home. We need to talk about your behavior tonight. No response. By the time we pulled up to our house, I was seething. The lights were on inside, which meant Thomas was definitely home. Good. I wasn't in the mood to wait for him to slink back from wherever he might have gone to sulk. I paid the driver and marched up to the front door, mentally rehearsing all the things I was going to say about responsibility and maturity, and not embarrassing your spouse in front of friends. I unlocked the door and stepped inside, ready for battle. What I found instead stopped me in my tracks. Thomas was sitting calmly on our living room couch, a glass with what looked like whiskey on the coffee table in front of him. Thomas rarely drank anything stronger than beer. The sight of that whiskey glass sent a warning signal through me. You're home, I said, dropping my purse on the entryway table. Care to explain what the hell that was about? Thomas looked up at me, and I almost took a step back. His eyes were clear and focused, but there was something different about him, something I'd never seen before. He looked resolved. Actually, he said, his voice level, I do have something to say. He gestured to the armchair across from him. Sit down, Lauren. I stayed standing, crossing my arms. No, I don't think I will. You left me stranded at that party. Do you have any idea how embarrassing that was? Thomas took a sip of his whiskey, completely unruffled by my outburst. You want to talk about embarrassment? Let's discuss what it felt like to have my wife call me a beta in front of my closest friends. Let's talk about you implying I have some kind of foot fetish just to get a laugh from Ryan. It was a joke. I threw up my hands. Why are you being so sensitive about this? It wasn't a joke, Lauren. His calm was eerie. It was the latest in a pattern of behavior that I've tolerated for far too long. You've been trying to humiliate me for months. That's ridiculous, I scoffed, though something cold settled in my stomach. I've been trying to help you be more assertive. No. He shook his head slowly. You've been trying to turn me into something I'm not. You've been comparing me to your exes, criticizing my decisions, undermining me in front of our friends. And tonight, you crossed a line. I finally sat down, not because he'd told me to, but because my legs suddenly felt weak. You're blowing this way out of proportion. Am I? Thomas leaned forward slightly. Would you ever speak to your boss the way you speak to me? Would you tell your friends they're betas if they compromise with their spouses? I didn't know how to answer that. The truth was, I wouldn't dream of speaking to anyone else that way. But Thomas was Thomas. He could take it. He was supposed to take it. I want a divorce, Lauren. He said it so simply, like he was commenting on the weather. I felt like I'd been slapped. A divorce? Are you insane? Because of one comment at a party? No. Thomas shook his head again. Because of a pattern that's become unbearable. Because you don't respect me, and you never have. I've already spoken to a lawyer. I've been documenting your behavior for months. You're being ridiculous, I said, trying to regain control of the situation. You're upset, I get it. I went too far, I'm sorry, okay? But we can work through this. There's nothing to work through. His voice was still so calm, and that scared me more than if he'd been yelling. You called me a beta because you thought I wouldn't stand up to you. You thought I would just take it like I've taken everything else. But that ends tonight. Thomas, please. I could hear the desperation creeping into my voice. Think about what you're saying. Think about everything we've built together. I helped you prepare for that promotion interview. I've supported your career." He actually laughed at that, a short, humorless sound. Supported me? By telling me I wasn't assertive enough? By comparing me to your ex who would have handled it differently? That's not support, Lauren. That's control disguised as help. That's not fair. I was starting to panic now. This wasn't my Thomas. My Thomas didn't talk like this, didn't make decisions like this. You're being emotional right now. Let's talk about this tomorrow when you've calmed down. I am calm, he said, and the terrible thing was, he really was. I'm staying at Ryan's for a few weeks until we sort out the separation details. I've already packed a bag. Ryan's? I repeated incredulously. The same Ryan you just accused me of trying to impress? He offered when I called him after leaving the party. Thomas stood up, picking up his whiskey glass. I'll come by next week to get more of my things. I'd appreciate it if you weren't here when I do. You can't just leave, I said, jumping to my feet. We need to talk about this. We just did. He walked to the kitchen and placed his glass in the sink. Goodbye, Lauren. My lawyer will be in touch. And then he was gone. The door closing quietly behind him. No dramatic slam, no final shouting match, just a calm, deliberate exit that somehow felt more final than any explosion could have. The next few days were a blur of unanswered texts, ignored calls, and growing panic. Thomas never responded to any of my messages, which ranged from angry to apologetic to desperate. By the fourth day, I received an email. An email, not even a text, from Thomas with the contact information for his lawyer and a request to communicate through them from now on. I called Alyssa in tears, finally ready to admit something was seriously wrong. He says he wants a divorce, I sobbed into the phone. Over one stupid joke at a party. There was a long pause before Alyssa spoke. Lauren, honey, was it really just one joke? Her hesitation made me sit up straighter. What's that supposed to mean? It's just the way you talk about Thomas, sometimes, she said carefully. The comparisons to your exes, the little digs about him not being assertive enough. I've noticed it for a while. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. So you're taking his side? After he abandoned me at that party? By the end of the week, I realized it wasn't just Alyssa. None of our mutual friends were reaching out to check on me. Even my own friends seemed strangely reserved when I told them what had happened, asking questions like, "What exactly did you say to him?" instead of immediately agreeing that Thomas was overreacting. The following Monday, I came home from work to find a note on the kitchen counter saying Thomas had collected some more of his clothes and personal items. He'd used his key while I was out, just as he'd said he would. There was no "I miss you" or "let's talk," just a formal notification that he'd been there. 2 weeks after the party, I received official divorce papers from his lawyer. The grounds were irreconcilable differences, that meaningless phrase that could cover anything from different opinions on having children to, apparently, publicly humiliating your spouse. I called Thomas's office in desperation, only to be told by his assistant that he didn't want to speak to me and would appreciate it if I stopped calling. His assistant knew. His coworkers probably knew. Everyone knew that Thomas had left his wife because she was cruel to him. The unfairness of it burned inside me. One comment? Okay, maybe a pattern of comments, but nothing that justified this nuclear response, and suddenly I was the bad guy? Thomas was the one who had given up on our marriage without even trying to fix things. 3 months after the party, I heard through Alyssa that Thomas had gotten another promotion at work. She mentioned it casually, like she didn't realize she was twisting the knife. I also found out he was dating someone, Melanie's cousin, some bookstore owner named Claire, who was apparently really sweet and quiet. The exact opposite of me, in other words. Meanwhile, I was struggling. The apartment I could afford on just my salary was half the size of our house, and in a neighborhood I'd always looked down on. I'd had to cut back on shopping, dinners out, all the little luxuries I'd gotten used to in our marriage. Thomas had always been generous, handling most of our larger expenses without complaint, and I hadn't realized how much come to depend on his income. More painful than the financial adjustments was the social fallout. Invitations dried up. Couples we'd been friends with suddenly became busy whenever I suggested getting together. Even my own family seemed to take Thomas's side, with my mother asking pointed questions about what really happened. It wasn't fair. None of it was fair. I wasn't the monster everyone was making me out to be. Thomas was the one who had given up, who had walked away when things got tough. I was the wronged party here, not him. But in my quieter moments, when I was alone in my new apartment, scrolling through old photos or lying awake at night, I could almost hear Thomas's voice from that last night. You didn't support me, Lauren. You tolerated me while trying to change me. The divorce was finalized last week. Thomas is gone, moving forward with his new promotion and his new girlfriend and his new life. And I'm here, alone, still convinced that what I did wasn't that big of a deal, that he overreacted, that this whole situation is unfair. So here's my advice. Be careful what you say to the quiet ones. Sometimes they're not putting up with your crap because they're weak. Sometimes they're putting up with it because they're strong enough to take it. Until suddenly, they're strong enough not to anymore.